It was late February 1944. The war in Europe was turning, cities were burning, armies retreating, and the skies above Germany had become a graveyard of metal and smoke. That morning, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, call sign Raven 1, took off from Stuttgart Airfield under gray clouds thick with snow. Its mission, photograph Allied troop movements west of the Rhine. It never returned. Witnesses in the small village of Freudenstadt claimed they saw something that day. An engine whining too low, a flash of light, and then silence. No explosion, no debris, just a distant echo swallowed by the forest. Search parties scoured the hills for weeks, guided by reports of smoke, but nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace. The only evidence was a final radio transmission intercepted at 15:42 hours. A single, broken phrase, descending through cloud cover, coordinates unconfirmed, then static. The Luftwaffe logged the incident as loss due to combat conditions, another number in a war of countless numbers. But the official record never matched the eyewitness reports. No Allied aircraft were operating in that region. No radar contact was ever recorded. And most haunting of all, no emergency beacon ever activated. It was as if the plane had slipped through the fabric of the sky itself. Decades later, villagers still whispered about what they saw that winter afternoon, the strange metallic hum that lingered long after the sound of engines faded, and the faint red glow that pulsed behind the tree line for hours. Some called it an explosion, others a flare. But those who had lived long enough swore it wasn't fire. It was something else, something alive. The story of Raven 1 became local folklore, passed between generations like a ghost story. Parents told their children to stay out of the forest after dark. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go near the western ridge where the plane was last seen. And when the wind blew from the north, people said they could still hear the faint droning of engines high above the trees, searching for a landing that would never come. Officially, the lost aircraft was piloted by Captain Heinrich Vogel, 32 years old, a veteran with more than 80 sorties to his name. His co-pilot, Karl Brenner, was barely 20, the son of a machinist from Dresden whose mother believed her boy was stationed safely in Munich. The third man was Otto Weiss, a quiet radio operator known among his peers for his brilliance with code and for the rumors that followed him. Some said Otto had intercepted secret Allied transmissions no one else could decrypt. Others whispered he had discovered something he wasn't meant to hear. Their flight plan made no sense. The orders in the archive show a westward route toward France, but the weather reports for that day rendered such a path suicidal. Storms blanketed the Alps. Icy winds tore through the valleys. Yet Vogel's plane was cleared for takeoff at dawn, carrying reconnaissance cameras and sealed crates marked Technische Versuchsabteilung, Technical Experimental Division. When the plane failed to return, the Luftwaffe command issued a brief statement, presumed shot down. But internally, officers knew better. No Allied fighters were sighted within 200 kilometers. The disappearance was impossible to explain, and quietly, it was buried. After the war, fragments of the story began to re-emerge through whispers in refugee camps and among former pilots. Some swore Vogel's crew had been part of a secret defection mission, fleeing to neutral Switzerland with stolen intelligence. Others claimed they had been testing experimental radar cloaking, one of Hitler's wonder weapons. None of it was proven, but one thing was clear. Someone wanted the story forgotten. Military files referencing the crew were redacted, and families were discouraged from asking questions. When Vogel's wife petitioned for his death certificate in 1948, she received a terse reply, no record of service found, as if her husband had never existed. For decades, the story slept beneath layers of silence and snow until time itself seemed to erase it. But history has a way of leaving traces buried deeper than memory, waiting for the right hands to dig them up. And one day, 78 years after that flight vanished, someone finally did. In the years following the war, the Black Forest began to change, not in ways that could be easily seen on a map, but in the quiet things, the way animals avoided certain valleys, how compasses spun without reason, and how the night seemed to hum faintly when the wind moved through the trees. Locals spoke of strange mechanical noises echoing through the woods long after the fighting had ended. Some said it was leftover machinery from the war. Others believed something beneath the ground was still running. In 1948, a group of loggers clearing trees near the village of Kaltenbrunn stumbled upon a patch of scorched earth. Trees twisted by heat, bark turned black like charcoal. Embedded in the soil were fragments of something metallic, melted and warped beyond recognition. The men thought they'd found aircraft wreckage, but no serial numbers, no insignia, and no fuselage were ever recovered. The pieces were light, aluminum perhaps, but oddly magnetic. Over the next few years, hikers found more anomalies. A circular depression in the ground where grass refused to grow, shards of glass shaped like cockpit panels. And on quiet nights, when fog settled low, some claimed they could see flickers of light under the forest floor, as though something deep below was still alive. German authorities eventually fenced off the area. Officially, it was because of unexploded ordnance, the standard excuse for sites best left untouched. Signs went up in both German and English: "Betreten verboten," danger, munitions. Patrols were irregular but firm. Locals who strayed too close were turned away by men who refused to say who they worked for. But people talked. Farmers claimed their livestock would panic near the western ridge. A forest ranger reported hearing metallic breathing from the ravine near Vogelskopf Hill. He filed an incident report, but it was quietly removed from the municipal records. As the decades passed, the mystery became folklore. Children dared each other to sneak past the warning signs. Tourists called it the forest that eats plains, and while most dismissed it as superstition, a few wondered if something far older, or far stranger, was buried beneath the Black Forest, waiting for the day someone would dig too deep. 54 years later, the mystery returned, not from the forest, but from a forgotten drawer in an archive basement. In 1998, a university student named Anna Köhler was writing her master's thesis on Cold War bunkers hidden across southern Germany. Her research took her to the Federal Military Archives in Freiburg, where she spent long, quiet days sifting through boxes of declassified reports. Most were routine, supply ledgers, construction blueprints, weather logs, until she found one file that didn't belong. It was thin, misplaced in a section labeled Post-War Demolitions. The cover was stamped Luftwaffe, 1944, and marked with a red diagonal line, Vertraulich, classified. Inside were just 3 pages, a mission manifest, a flight path, and a single note dated 1947, signed by a name she didn't recognize. The manifest listed a reconnaissance flight out of Stuttgart. 3 crew members, aircraft model BF-110. Destination, to be disclosed. The coordinates were nonsense, pointing not to France, but to an uninhabited region deep in the Black Forest, miles from any wartime target. The flight had been logged as lost in action, but what caught Anna's attention wasn't the mission itself. It was the handwriting scrawled in the margins in faded blue ink. "Do not excavate." Sealed 1947. Anna checked the index for reference numbers, but none matched. There was no record of a recovery mission, no follow-up investigation, nothing. The file had been placed among demolition reports from 1952, an era long after the war had ended. Someone had hidden it in plain sight. When Anna mentioned her find to the archivist on duty, his demeanor changed. He asked for the file's number, then quietly took it from her hands and said, "That document should not have been there." The next day, when she returned to continue her research, the box was gone. But Anna had written down the coordinates before she left. They pointed to a barren mountain slope south of Freudenstadt, an area known for its collapsed mining tunnels and restricted forestry zones. She didn't know it then, but she had just reopened a mystery buried for over half a century, and the warning in the margin, those 3 simple words, were about to prove more literal than anyone could have imagined. By the spring of 2022, most of Germany's wartime ruins had long been catalogued, restored, or sealed away. Yet beneath the Black Forest, whispers persisted, of bunkers never mapped, of tunnels that led nowhere, and of sealed caverns where compasses failed. When a joint German-British archaeological initiative received clearance to investigate military sites of the 1940s, the approval slipped through with little fanfare. On paper, the project was purely historical, a documentation of forgotten infrastructure built by the Third Reich in its final desperate years. But unofficially, the team's true interest was the mysterious coordinates found decades earlier, the same ones scribbled with the warning, "Do not excavate." Sealed 1947. The team consisted of 6 specialists, archaeologists, geophysicists, and one historian named Dr. Anna Köhler, the same student who had uncovered the file nearly 24 years earlier. Now older, with a career built on Cold War research, she had never forgotten the mystery that started it all. The expedition would finally give her a chance to prove what she'd long suspected, that the Black Forest still held secrets the war had buried alive. They established base near a decommissioned ranger station 2 miles outside the restricted zone. Official access came with limitations. They were to map and photograph any remaining structures, but not conduct full excavations without additional permits. Still, within days of scanning the terrain, anomalies began to appear. Using ground-penetrating radar, the geophysical team detected irregularities beneath the mountain slope near Freudenstadt, voids, angular shapes, and what appeared to be a buried corridor running over 200 meters in length. It was too deep, too precise to be natural. And most unsettling of all, the soil composition suggested the site had been intentionally reinforced, and then collapsed from above. Local authorities warned them to proceed cautiously. The site, they said, was unstable and potentially contaminated. But when the scanners revealed a hollow chamber below the debris, Anna made the call to investigate further. After all, they weren't treasure hunters. They were scientists seeking truth. Yet truth, as they were about to learn, often hides behind the sound of shovels breaking ground. What they found beneath that mountain would not only rewrite their understanding of history, but also ignite a chain of discoveries that would challenge everything they believed about what the Third Reich had been capable of building, and why. It took 3 days of excavation before the first opening appeared. Beneath a collapsed mine shaft, hidden behind a wall of compacted earth, they found the faint outline of a steel door. Its hinges were fused by rust, its surface blackened by decades of damp decay. But it was unmistakably man-made, and unlike anything the team had encountered before. The door led into darkness so absolute that the light from their headlamps seemed to dissolve before touching the walls. The air was stale, heavy, almost oily. As they descended, the sound of their footsteps echoed along narrow concrete passages lined with rails, old mine tracks leading deeper underground. And somewhere ahead, faintly, the metallic scent of fuel drifted through the stillness. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel changed. The rough rock gave way to smooth concrete, then to steel plates bolted into the walls. It was less a mine than a bunker, an engineered labyrinth built to withstand time itself. At the 50-meter mark, they found evidence of machinery, corroded pressure valves, fragments of tubing, and a set of electrical cables fused to the ceiling. But there was no power source, no generator, nothing to explain why their electronic equipment kept flickering every few minutes. When the first chamber opened before them, the team stopped in silence. It was vast, 20 meters across, perfectly circular, with a grated floor and what looked like rail tracks spiraling inward like the spokes of a wheel. The air was colder here, carrying that same faint odor of aviation fuel. The walls were stained with soot, and a single faded symbol was painted near the far corner, a black eagle, its wings fractured by rust. Dr. Kohler recorded everything, her voice steady but tinged with awe. "This wasn't a storage tunnel," she whispered. "It's something else. Something built for movement." One of the engineers traced a hand over a section of the wall and realized it wasn't solid. It rang hollow, like the skin of an aircraft. When they pried it open, they found what looked like the nose cone of a plane, buried in the rock itself. The chamber wasn't just a bunker, it was a tomb. And whatever was entombed inside had been waiting, sealed in perfect silence, for almost 80 years. By the time the archaeologists broke through the final layer of soil, they knew they were standing on the edge of something extraordinary. The hollow space behind the chamber wall wasn't just a cavity, it was an aircraft hangar buried beneath the mountain itself. When their floodlights swept through the darkness, the shape emerged like a ghost, sleek, metallic, untouched by time. It was a Messerschmitt Bf-110, perfectly preserved, its twin engines gleaming faintly beneath layers of dust. The wings were folded back in a way no known variant was designed to do, as if the aircraft had been prepared for storage, not flight. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and decay. Every footstep echoed like thunder through the chamber. When they climbed the rusted scaffolding toward the cockpit, they realized the plane wasn't empty. Through the cracked glass, 3 figures sat frozen in time, skeletons still in flight suits, their helmets tilted forward as if in silent prayer. The seats' harnesses remained buckled, their boots rested on the pedals. One bony hand still clutched the throttle. Dr. Kohler's breath caught in her throat as she peered through the window. The uniforms bore Luftwaffe insignia, faded but unmistakable. The instruments were intact, the dials still labeled in Gothic script. But there was something else, something impossible. The cabin wasn't crushed or warped by a crash. There were no impact marks, no signs of fire or explosion. The Messerschmitt hadn't fallen from the sky. It had been placed there. When they pried open the cockpit hatch, stale air hissed outward, carrying the faint metallic scent of death. Inside, the seats were coated in a fine gray dust. Ashes, perhaps, but the control panel glimmered as if frozen in time. In the radio compartment, someone had scribbled a message in chalk across the wall. "Wir sind nicht allein here." We are not alone here. The team photographed everything, but the deeper they documented, the stranger it became. The oxygen gauges were full. The ignition switches were off. It was as though the crew had shut everything down themselves, then waited. Near the navigator's seat, tucked neatly in a leather pouch, was a bound journal, a pilot's logbook. The last entry was dated February 26, 1944, the very day Raven 1 vanished over the Black Forest. The discovery of the logbook sent ripples of disbelief through the entire excavation team. How could something written nearly 80 years earlier look so fresh? The ink had faded only slightly, the paper brittle, yet legible, protected by the sealed cockpit's airless void. But what chilled everyone wasn't the condition of the book, it was what it said. The early pages were standard flight notes, weather reports, reconnaissance coordinates, engine maintenance, but the tone began to change halfway through. The entries grew erratic, written in hurried script, sometimes smeared as if the writer's hands had been shaking. On February 25th, one line stood out. "Orders received from Division Command. Rendezvous point changed. Coordinates classified." The next entry came after the day the plane was officially declared missing. Feb 27, fuel reserves sufficient, entering descent through cloud formation, radio silence maintained. Tunnels confirmed beneath target zone. The final page was dated 2 days after the aircraft had supposedly been lost. A short sentence, underlined twice. "Descending into the tunnels. Orders confirmed. We are not returning." No mission logs, no Luftwaffe records, and no known commanding officer corresponded with those orders. Whoever gave them had operated outside official channels. Dr. Kohler's voice trembled as she read the words aloud to the team. They exchanged uneasy glances, descending into the tunnels, as if the crew had intentionally flown underground. But why? And how had they known about the tunnels before they even existed on wartime maps? Further examination of the cockpit revealed evidence of modification: ventilation pipes routed into the fuselage, filters attached to oxygen lines, and an experimental electrical system that didn't match any known Messerschmitt design. It was as though the plane had been refitted for a mission that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with secrecy. When the team attempted to remove the logbook for preservation, the binding cracked open slightly, revealing a folded slip of paper pressed between the final pages. On it, written in faint pencil, were 5 words: Nachtsturmbase secured. Proceed below. The room went silent. Outside, the wind howled through the mine shaft like a distant engine still searching for altitude. And for the first time, the archaeologists realized the truth. The plane hadn't crashed at all. It had landed there, deep beneath the mountain, following orders no one was ever meant to read. The discovery of the buried Messerschmitt was only the beginning. As the team continued to excavate, they realized the chamber was merely an entrance, one of several tunnels branching out like veins beneath the mountain. With each layer of rock removed, a new passage emerged, revealing an entire underground complex sealed from the world since 1945. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that this was no abandoned mine. It was a facility, engineered, deliberate, and far more advanced than anything known to have existed at the time. Rusting fuel drums lined the walls, each marked with faded Luftwaffe emblems and chemical warnings in German script. Old communication cables ran along the ceiling, ending in a half-collapsed control room where relics of wartime technology lay frozen in place. Radio transmitters, oscilloscopes, and mechanical calculators coated in decades of dust. On a nearby table, under a cracked layer of glass, the team found maps, hand-drawn outlines of Western Europe covered in red lines and arrows. Each arrow pointed not to military targets, but to mountain ranges, riverbeds, and underground caverns. And then came the most unsettling discovery: a stack of blueprints preserved in a sealed metal canister, labeled Project Nachtsturm, Night Storm Project. The designs inside showed aircraft far beyond 1940s engineering, sleek, angular shapes powered by engines resembling early jet turbines, but with mechanisms no historian could identify. Some diagrams even depicted vertical takeoff and propulsion systems decades ahead of modern aviation. Whoever built this base had been experimenting with technologies the world wasn't meant to see. As they cataloged each find, the air inside the tunnels grew colder, heavier. The Geiger counter ticked softly in the background, though no one could determine why. There was no sign of weapons testing or radiation sources, just an energy, faint but constant, pulsing deep within the rock. In one corner of the main chamber, Dr. Kohler brushed away a layer of dust and revealed a single phrase painted on the wall in black letters: Flug ohne Himmel, flight without sky. The team exchanged uneasy glances. It matched the logbook's cryptic final words and suggested that Nachtsturm wasn't about war, but something far stranger. If the Messerschmitt had been the vessel, then this was its cradle. And somewhere in these tunnels, the reason for its burial waited, sealed behind another door, marked only with a date: April 1945. As the investigation deepened, fragments of historical records began to surface, most of them redacted, some barely legible. One name appeared again and again, connected to Nachtsturm's funding and design: Dr. Otto Hahn, Jr., a physicist, son of the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Otto Hahn, and a man who had vanished in the chaotic final weeks of World War II. At the time, official reports claimed he'd fled Berlin as Allied forces closed in. But others told a different story, that he had been reassigned to a classified Luftwaffe research division specializing in unconventional propulsion and spatial acoustics. To historians, it sounded like pseudoscience. To the archaeologists standing beneath the mountain, it suddenly made perfect sense. Among the papers recovered from the control room, one document bore Hahn Jr.'s signature. It referenced Phase 3 of subterranean resonance testing and listed the same coordinates found in the vanished aircraft's logbook. The phrase repeated throughout his notes was as haunting as it was cryptic. Der Himmel unten, the sky below. Witnesses from the post-war years recalled him as brilliant but unhinged, a man consumed by the idea that flight did not belong to the air, but to the vibrations beneath the earth. He spoke of magnetic caverns, of hidden frequencies capable of generating lift without combustion, of machines that would rise not into the clouds, but through the crust itself. His colleagues dismissed him as delusional. Then he disappeared. Now, standing in the cold, echoing tunnels of Nachtsturm, the archaeologists realized Hahn might have been here all along. His handwriting appeared in the margins of the blueprints, his formulas etched onto the walls of an adjoining lab. One phrase appeared again and again, scrawled in chalk, as though he'd written it moments before sealing himself inside. Resonanzzonen aktiv. Keep testing. The deeper the team went, the stronger the metallic hum became, steady, rhythmic, pulsing. From somewhere beyond the final corridor, it was faint but unmistakable, like a heartbeat buried in stone. And for the first time, Dr. Köhler began to understand what Hahn had meant by flight without sky. Whatever he'd built down here had never stopped. It had simply been waiting for them. The further the excavation team pressed into the labyrinth beneath the Black Forest, the more the story of Project Nachtsturm began to twist into something almost unimaginable. In one of the lower tunnels, sealed behind a rusted bulkhead marked Vertraulich, they found several oil drums buried in neat formation, their lids welded shut. When opened, the contents inside were astonishing. The drums weren't filled with fuel, but with documents, thousands of pages preserved in waxed paper, stamped with Luftwaffe insignia, and signed by officers whose names had long vanished from official war records. Most of the files were lists, flight manifests, coded transmissions, supply requests, all dated between February and April of 1945, the chaotic final months of the Third Reich. But mixed among them were letters, personal notes, and one chilling memorandum titled Directive 47, Nachtsturm Continuation Order. The language was cryptic, yet unmistakable. Nachtsturm wasn't a weapons project. It was an evacuation. The papers spoke of an exodus, selected personnel, ordered to relocate via subterranean corridors to a location described only as Haven Nord. The tone was desperate, written in the final days before Germany's collapse. Surface routes compromised, airspace lost, proceed below, departure to continue under blackout conditions. But escape to where, the documents never said. Some implied that the network of tunnels stretched far beyond the Black Forest, connecting to other regions, Austria, the Alps, even the North Sea coast. Others mentioned vertical transit chambers, diagrams that looked suspiciously like elevators built for cargo or passengers. Rumors spread quickly among the team. Had the buried aircraft been part of this exodus? Were the three pilots meant to lead others to safety below ground rather than through the skies above? If so, who had sealed them inside? And why had no one ever followed? Dr. Köhler read one fragment repeatedly, a handwritten note in smudged ink. When the Reich falls, we will not. The new world will begin beneath the old. It sounded more like prophecy than protocol, as if Nachtsturm's architects believed they could outlast defeat itself. But history had swallowed them whole. The escape they planned never came to pass, and the tunnels they built became their tomb. Or so the archaeologists thought, until they found the final chamber and the grim evidence of what really happened down there. When the remains inside the Messerschmitt were finally examined, the truth was more horrifying than anyone had expected. The forensic team confirmed that all three crew members had died the same way, Not from impact, not from wounds, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. Their bones showed no signs of trauma. Their uniforms, though faded, were neatly arranged, their seat belts still fastened. It wasn't a crash. It was a slow, deliberate suffocation. Traces of soot lined the interior of the cockpit, a residue that told its own silent story. The engines had been running, not at full thrust, but idle, long enough to consume every trace of oxygen in the sealed chamber. The fuel tanks were half full, the control switches still set to start. The canopy had been locked from the inside. Doctor. Kohler's voice was barely audible as she read the preliminary report. They knew, she whispered. They sealed themselves in. The thought was unbearable. Had they done it willingly, obeying orders they didn't understand? Or had something gone wrong, a test gone fatal, a system that turned their own machine into a coffin? Further analysis deepened the mystery. Chemical residues suggested that the air in the chamber had been artificially filtered before the final moments, as though someone had tried to maintain breathable conditions until the very end. On the floor between the pilot and co-pilot lay a small, rusted key and a folded scrap of paper. The words were almost erased by time, but under infrared light they could just be read. Containment protocol active. Awaiting clearance to ascend. Ascend. The word echoed through the tunnels like a haunting refrain. It implied the unthinkable, that they hadn't meant to escape upward into the sky, but rather to return from beneath the earth. As the lights flickered in the stale air of Nachtsturm, the team began to feel what the pilots must have felt in those final hours. The engine's low hum, the thick air growing thin, the pounding in their chests as oxygen vanished, and darkness crept in. They hadn't crashed. They had been entombed, obedient to the end, sealed inside the belly of the mountain, waiting for orders that would never come. The deeper the archaeologists dug into Project Nachtsturm, the clearer it became that someone had already been here, decades before them. British military archives, long sealed and quietly digitized, held a single declassified report marked Black Forest Recovery Operation, 1947. It described a small reconnaissance team dispatched to investigate unexplained mechanical activity beneath the Freudenstadt region. The official account was brief. Subterranean facility discovered, site deemed unstable, entry sealed for public safety. No photographs, no coordinates, no details. But tucked at the bottom was a line that changed everything. Removed materials to RAF Lakenheath for analysis. When Dr. Kohler cross-referenced the entry with an old requisition log from the British Ministry of Defense, she found a match: 5 unmarked shipping crates recorded as recovered ordnance components. No description, no return record, no final destination. They had simply vanished from inventory. But an even more startling clue emerged when a retired engineer from the 1947 mission, now in his 90s, agreed to speak off the record. His memory was fractured by time, but his words were chilling. We weren't sealing a bunker. We were burying something that still hummed. Later that night, one of the research assistants uncovered a reel of unlisted film in the Freiburg archive. Its label read, Operation Nachtwind, Confidential. When they projected it onto a white wall in their field tent, the grainy footage flickered to life. British soldiers in heavy coats, dragging crates through a tunnel identical to the one they now stood in. Behind them, a shadowed shape, half metal, half stone, was being covered with sheets of tarpaulin. The film cut abruptly, ending with a frame of the same eagle insignia found inside the mountain, painted over with the words, "Do not return." The implications were impossible to ignore. The Allied forces had found Nachtsturm, had extracted something from it, and had then buried the rest. Whether they had done so to conceal a failed escape or to silence an experiment that had gone too far, no one could say. But the silence surrounding it had lasted almost 80 years, and the evidence left behind, the bones, the blueprints, the aircraft, felt less like history and more like a warning. Nachtsturm had not been destroyed. It had merely been hidden, waiting for the curious to open its grave again. The last artifact recovered from the site came from the jacket of the pilot, seated closest to the cockpit's shattered glass. Folded between two layers of fabric, preserved by the dry air of the tunnel, was a slip of parchment no larger than a playing card. It contained a single ciphered line, numbers and letters scrawled in pencil. When decoded by military linguists weeks later, the translation was simple, haunting. If we cannot reach the sky, we will build one below. For the archaeologists, it was the final piece of the puzzle, and the most unsettling. The message was not an order or a farewell, it was a declaration, a belief, a vow born out of desperation and blind faith. Whether the men of Nachtsturm had been trying to flee the ruins of the Reich or forge something new beneath it, no longer mattered. They had surrendered to an idea that humanity could outrun its own downfall by burrowing deeper instead of rising higher. The phrase spread through the team like a chill. We will build one below. It spoke of ambition twisted into delusion, of genius consumed by fear. Perhaps the pilots had been promised salvation, an underground world untouched by war where they could start again. Or perhaps they were simply following orders, loyal to the end, entombed in a dream that died before it could take shape. When the archaeologists finally sealed the site once more, the wind through the tunnels seemed to carry that final message back to them, a whisper of defiance echoing from the past. Doctor. Köhler paused before leaving, her flashlight glancing across the words painted years earlier on the wall. Flug ohne Himmel, flight without sky. For a long moment she stood in silence. What drove them here, faith, fear, or madness, may never be known. But in the cold heart of the Black Forest, beneath stone and silence, one truth endures. The need to escape can make men dig their own graves and call them heavens. By autumn of the following year, the excavation site beneath the Black Forest was officially closed. The German Historical Preservation Office, together with the British Ministry of Defense, issued a joint statement. The tunnels would remain sealed for reasons of structural safety and cultural protection. But those who had walked their depths knew the truth. This wasn't preservation. It was containment. Steel gates were welded across the main entrance. Warning signs were posted in 4 languages. Access was limited to researchers with high-level clearance, though even they would never be allowed beyond the first chamber. The Messerschmitt Bf-110, the plane that had waited in silence for nearly 8 decades, was left exactly where it had been found, its cockpit sealed once more. No glass cases, no museum placards, no cameras. Just the aircraft, alone in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of its creators and the unanswered questions they left behind. Dr. Anna Köhler wrote the final report. It ran 312 pages, dense with photographs, transcriptions, and maps. But between the scientific analysis and the historical citations, one passage stood out, a quiet reflection that would never make it to publication. Some disappearances are never solved because the truth lies deeper than we dare dig. Perhaps some stories are meant to remain buried, not out of fear, but out of mercy. When the last floodlight was turned off, the tunnels exhaled one final breath of cold air, as if the mountain itself were sighing in relief. The archaeologists packed their equipment in silence. No one spoke on the drive back to town. Behind them, the forest closed over the trail, branches bending like fingers to erase the path they'd made. Months later, hikers reported hearing a low hum rising from beneath the soil near Freudenstadt, a sound like distant engines fading in and out with the wind. Locals dismissed it as groundwater or machinery from nearby quarries. But on certain still nights, when fog rolled down the hills and the trees stood motionless, the sound changed. It became rhythmic, pulsing, almost alive. If you listen closely, they say, you can still hear it. The faint echo of propeller blades turning somewhere deep below, waiting for orders that will never come. And as the last drop of water falls into the black silence of Nachtsturm's tomb, the forest keeps its final secret, unchanged, unbroken, and undisturbed. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.